Right, finally then, we're on to the stop and search item. And again, this is one that we fairly regularly report on. It is an issue that does attract a lot of attention from time to time, nationally and locally. But you know, we have introduced different ways of addressing this in West Yorkshire through the best use of stop and search and the introduction of the ride-along schemes, which is included in the report. So, would you like to introduce this, Dee? Thanks.
Yeah, so we're going to give you the annual update in terms of stop and search statistics, and then I'd welcome a little bit of a discussion about what kind of stop and search activity we might want to consider in the future, given that I don't personally think everything about adopting best use of stop and search has actually been as helpful as it was originally intended. And I say that because of the levels of serious violent crime that we are now seeing across the country, and indeed West Yorkshire. We have too many people who think they're not going to be stop and searched whilst carrying weapons and so on. So I just think that I'd welcome a conversation at the end as well about what we want to do next. Okay, Catherine.
Okay. As you've mentioned, clearly this is an area which hugely impacts on public confidence if we get this wrong. It's a controversial issue. It's something that has to be handled really sensitively, but as I think the Chief was just alluding to, it is a really important and effective policing tool which we shouldn't forget about. And I think sometimes it's very difficult for our members of staff when they do see the amount of scrutiny, quite rightly, that gets put on this, but it makes people a little bit nervous in terms of utilising it as what is a really good policing tool. So I think that we need to really strike that balance as the leadership team about how we pass that message to people. So I've got a few figures to go over here, so just bear with me whilst I read through a few things so that I don't get them wrong. So over the last 12 months, we've seen just over 8,300 stop searches across West Yorkshire, which is a reduction of around 3,000 compared to the previous reporting period. When we look at that activity and the stop and searches over the past 12 months, we know that around 30% of all our stop and search activity is focused on people from a BME background, which, if we look at the census data, is 12% higher than our population, but I think that comes with a caveat that that data is fairly old now. I think it's 2011 data, isn't it?
On the census, yeah.
And I think, speaking to local elected members and districts, I think they would say that probably if that was done again and it was more accurately reflected, we'd have a higher percentage in terms of BME population across West Yorkshire. So I say that just to kind of set things into context. Part of the scrutiny that we have around this looks at disproportionality, as I've just mentioned, in terms of stop and search and the different areas of stop and search. And one of the things that we've just done is a fairly in-depth look at some of our most disproportionate wards, if you like, in terms of stop and search. And we have asked our district leads in those particular areas to come back via the local policing governance board to explain and provide a narrative really around whether they feel that those stop searches are entirely intelligence-led, whether there is an amount of unconscious bias that might creep in terms of what people hear on briefings and so on. To try and help us to understand. The other thing as well is that we've been able to break down in terms of at ward level the different percentages of different communities and populations. So in some areas actually the number of people stop search from a BME background is hugely it is very much lower than the population of the BME people that live in that area. So there's lots of different variations when you look at these figures. It's not quite as straightforward as I think looking at a West Yorkshire point of view is.
I think you're right, because we know that there's some wards that are just hugely diverse,
Yes.
which is just totally different to a ward not very far away in
Yeah.
the same district.
Yeah. So we
Yeah.
need to understand those
Yeah.
differences and
Yeah.
understand if there's particular places where, like I say, unconscious bias might be at
Yeah.
play versus actually we've had some really good intelligence in from members of the community, Crime Stoppers, etc. That's been on a briefing and people have gone out and done intelligence-led stop search, which is exactly what we want
Yeah.
people to do. When we look at the age profile of people that are stop and searched, it's not probably any surprise to know that the biggest majority of people between 16 and 29, make up the biggest proportion of our offending population, and they are more likely the people, I think, that are kind of out and about as well. So clearly the older, you're probably not going to have people in the 90s that are being stop and searched for a variety of reasons. There was an increase in the psychoactive substances that were being stop and searched for, and I think that's very much to do with the increase in the media reporting around that. Members of the public understand a little bit more, they hear about spice all the time on the news and so on, so they're much more proactive in reporting things to us. And I think our staff as well are just much more aware of these kind of issues over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, so I think that probably accounts for that increase. There's very little difference between the number of stop searches that we do in terms of Section 23, misuse of drugs, and Section 1 of PACE, which is kind of offensive weapons and stolen goods. The good news, I think, and which is something that we really should sort of take account of, is that the positive outcome over the last 12 months in terms of stop and search of 22.8%, which is an increase of 3.3% over the last year, which I would suggest tells us that our officers are stopping the right people. They're finding things, which is good in terms of preventing things from happening and making communities safer. And would lead you to think that there is more evidence of an intelligence-led approach to stop and search, which I think is a really good thing. We talk in the report about there being 41 strip searches having been done, with 70% of them being carried out on people with who self-define as being BME, which is a 39% increase. But I suppose in looking at those figures, they are relatively small numbers, and so those increases probably account, I think, for about 8 people in difference. So whilst a 39% increase might seem like a big amount, it's not very much in terms of people, but they are looked at in terms of the making sure that they are appropriate, because clearly that is a very intrusive power. Chief mentioned the best use of stop and search scheme, which we are part of in West Yorkshire Police. Key aspects of that being the use of Section 60 powers and the different elements of authority that are needed for that. The stop and search community triggers and the ride-along scheme, which you've already mentioned. We haven't had any Section 60 authorities since the last report. We have had some. West Yorkshire Police obviously set the community trigger threshold at 1 complaint from within a district, so that every complaint activates a trigger. And there have been 4 complaints, 2 from Bradford and 2 from Leeds in the last 12-month period, which I have got details of, which we can discuss either outside of the meeting, but essentially they have been dealt with via our standards department and have been finalised, one of which is still in appeal status. The ride-along scheme, I think, is a really positive news in terms of, I think last time we reported on this, we've not seen that many people take up the ride-along scheme, probably because it hadn't been publicised quite as well as we'd hoped it would have been. But I really set districts the task to publicise that, and I think they've done a really good job, and we've now had a total of 188 really evenly spread across the districts, actually, with Leeds really doing a great job, actually, in terms of that. And we have had some good feedback, which we then act upon at the end of those ride-alongs with members of the public. So in terms of work that's ongoing then, as you know, we have scrutiny panels on our IAG, and they we've now been able to, I think there were some issues before in terms of vetting and IT, but we've been able to iron those problems out now, and we're able to show body-worn video footage of stop and search encounters, which clearly helps improve transparency and accountability, and also helps in terms of the message that those members of the panels can take out to community groups, especially younger community groups, so that we can help bridge that gap between understanding what to expect when people are stop and searched out and about in communities. The mobile device application has been developed, so now officers can create stop and search records for themselves. Previously they used to have to shout up and do that via the district control rooms, which sometimes led to delays and obviously a miscommunication of message. The fact that they're able to do that now themselves, I think, is a really good thing. What we're having to work on with some of the officers is the fact that because of the way that IT is set up, sometimes the addresses that are put on the stop and search records don't exactly match, and that makes it difficult in terms of searching and trying to understand who's been searched in what areas. So we're working on that with IT. And the other thing is that in quite a big category, the self-defined ethnicity is recorded as not stated. So for us, excuse me, what that means is that it might actually be skewing our disproportionality figures one way or another. It may well be that our disproportionality is not quite as great as we think it is, or it might be even greater, and we need to understand that. So what I've asked is that each of the districts dip sample a number of those not stated self-defined ethnicities, because all of those encounters should be on body-worn video, and the supervisors are able to watch that encounter and know whether it is our officers that are just not asking, whether we're asking and people are just really not happy with being stopped and are refusing to answer, in which case it would be down as not stated, or whether it's something on the IT, which means that if something's not pressed at a particular, it defaults back to not stated. So we need to understand that so that we can better understand the disproportionality. Clearly we need to report back to HMIC FRS in terms of stop and search, and we understand the areas that we need to report back on, many of which I've already touched upon, and that work is reporting back via the local policing governance board and the local accountability meetings on a monthly basis, so that we keep on top of, once we get an update on disproportionality, for example, if that throws up other questions, which it normally does, we can action that via that meeting and get some quick responses back. I think that's probably the highlights, the most significant things that I wanted to mention.
Okay, thanks. And we know that there's an HMIC report, don't we, as well, recently published around this, which sort of made some recommendations around monitoring and having the right data available, etc., which is sort of touched on in the report as well. Thanks for that. And just to back up what I said earlier around the ward data, that would be really helpful to know more about that work and getting a better, even better understanding to how we move forward with this. So that's more of a comment. Mm-hmm. I think one of the other questions I think you've already probably answered was around the understanding of the number of searches for persons aged between 30 to 44 under the Psychoactive Substances Act, has seen that 32% increase or thereabouts. I think you probably sort of answered that, but
I mean, I suppose the reality is, and Catherine touched upon this, is the sad prevalence of spice, and the impact of that on an individual is incredibly obvious to an average member of the public, who will ring us and say, we think this individual has taken drugs and actually is very vulnerable. So I'm not surprised that we are seeing more stop and searches, and actually we have a duty of care, don't we? First of all, we do have to find out whether or not an illegal substance is in their possession, but secondly, there's also the fact that they leave themselves incredibly vulnerable, which then is part and parcel of the conversation you were having right at the start, Commissioner, about wanting to better understand issues such as homelessness and so on, because I do think there's quite often a link here, unfortunately. So I'm not unduly surprised we're seeing an increase in those numbers of people who are being searched, nor indeed that particular age range either.
Okay. The section where you touched on the 41 strip searches, and does say that 70% of those carried out on persons who self-define as having a BME or BAME ethnicity, which is about a 40% increase on the period. And clearly, whilst the numbers might be relatively small, that still is a significant increase. Have you got any?
Yeah, it is, and like I say, I acknowledge that whilst I'm trying to put the numbers into context, it is a really intrusive power which we are very careful about how we use. So I think that issue around it being very often, or almost predominantly, I would imagine, used in terms of drugs, clearly, it goes without saying that it is much easier to conceal drugs in certain places that would require a strip search than it is other items that you might be looking for in terms of a Section 1 stop and search, for example. And so it's those two things in terms of an increased number of people from a BME background being stopped in terms of Section 23 drugs will then have an impact on the number of people that are strip searched. And when we look at that 41, 70% is 28 people, and I suppose what I was getting at is that's probably an increase of 21 to 22 people to 28. So not huge numbers, but a significant power, which we need to be very careful with how we use, and we are. So,
I think it just sort of underlines that trying to get a better understanding in some of that more detailed work within particular wards and areas.
Yeah.
Where we have to flag it because it clearly does raise that disproportionality aspect.
I suppose, and this is where I'm going to welcome the broader conversation. So I go out into communities, I meet relevant stakeholders from communities, and one of the big issues that is repeatedly reported to us is around street bleeding of drugs. And the community want to see us doing something about it. And clearly we are therefore going to focus some of our energy and efforts around this particular issue and exercising stop and search powers based on the information that's coming from the community themselves. So on the one hand, they want to see us having these interactions and doing something about it, and yet for understandable reasons they want us to use that power proportionately and appropriately. That's around the drugs matter. I am now getting increasingly concerned that we're seeing higher levels of violent crime than we've seen for some time across West Yorkshire. And I do worry that some of our people in communities feel that we are less likely to exercise that power and therefore less likely to find a potential weapon or something that could be used inappropriately. And so I think, again, we need to look at what the community profile is telling us, where the offending is taking place, and where victims are experiencing these difficulties, to then determine about greater use, perhaps, of these powers appropriately.
Yeah.
Disproportionality doesn't, therefore, automatically mean discrimination. We have to look very carefully at where incidents are taking place, what the communities want and expect from us, and do it appropriately. And that's where I think the body-worn video approach is incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
Because actually we can then explain to the public what we are doing and making sure that those interactions are fair, are transparent and are appropriate.
Yeah.
So I do think that actually the best use of stop and search perhaps now needs to move on into another phase, into a different phase, to help us make best use of stop and search powers where it's appropriate, but equally make sure that what we're doing is understood by the public.
Yeah, and you know, I've always said that if it's truly intelligence-led, then, you know, clearly there's a very good rationale for using that power. And I think, I can't remember where, but I think it may be Nottinghamshire, where they've recently increased their positive outcome rate very significantly based on some different approaches to stop and search. So it might be worth looking at what they've done if it is Nottinghamshire around the positive outcome rates, and that's, for me, that's the right thing to look at rather than just arrests. Because, you know, positive outcome rates are, you know, just wider than an arrest, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think what we're talking about is what Hampshire have been doing. So they have been exercising stop and search powers in a wider remit and encouraging the use of it. But you're quite right, Commissioner. It's been, how have they then dealt with the individual, and has that been appropriate? I just think this is going back to trying to ensure that we are really open and upfront about what we're doing, why we're doing it. And of course, fundamentally what we're trying to do here is to save people's lives, to protect people who are vulnerable, to reduce the amount of offending that's taking place in localities, and to build public confidence. But we can only do that if we're using the power appropriately. So I do think there's further conversations to be had, both with yourself and with the community, and encouraging our people to have the confidence, which is what Catherine was alluding to be able to use the power appropriately.
Yeah, yeah. And just finally, I mean, obviously I do welcome the increase in the number of ride-alongs, which have increased markedly. I think since the last time we looked at this, I mean, Leeds stands out as well in terms of the numbers. So whatever we're doing in Leeds clearly is working in terms of engagement, and if we can try and replicate that ethos in some of the other districts, that would be helpful. So I assume we get feedback from those and we use that.
We do.
Yeah.
So we ask, clearly there's a conversation that's had in the vehicle between the person who's on the ride along and the police officer anyway, and then at the end of their experience they will fill out a questionnaire which touches on a myriad of different things in relation to their interactions and their views about the different things that have been said and witnessed. And then those things are collated via our local policing department, and we can identify then via the stop and search lead any issues which might help us to think about different training that's needed, confidence building, any disproportionality, unconscious bias, all of those things that I've already spoken about.
Yeah. That
helps us to kind of, it's an extra set of eyes from a different angle, isn't it, in terms of telling us where they think we're perhaps doing things right and maybe getting things wrong in terms of this. And then I think importantly, the other thing, and I did touch upon it before, is that we've already started at Calderdale. We've had the first scrutiny panel whereby body-worn video footage of the encounters with police officers in the district have been viewed, which has been really positive, and that will be rolled out to the other district scrutiny panels in the next few months.
Excellent. Well, you've answered my what was to be my final question around body-worn video scrutiny panels. That's good to hear, and we look forward to that being rolled out, as you say. So I don't have any further questions on this, so thank you very much for that report.